Welcome to Chapter 5, Ethnocultural Variables that Affect Articulation and Phonological Development. In this unit, we'll be looking at African American English, Native American languages, Spanish language, Asian Pacific Islander languages, and some guidelines on working with children who have dual phonological repertoire. Ethnocultural variables. Every language, as we know, is spoken in its own unique way. There are many different variations of a language, yet one must bear this in mind, especially as we do evaluations as speech-language pathologists. It's also important for us to know, as a speech-language pathologist, to know the characteristics of the primary language when evaluating and treating clients. We have a lot of diversity, especially in the United States, and many people are born as bilingual speakers or have bilingual parents or maybe monolingual non-English speaking parents. This chapter is very important so that speech-language pathologists or people who are learning to be speech-language pathologists become more aware of the sensitivities of different cultures, ethnicities, and how people view some of those articulation and phonological differences. First, we'll be talking about African American English. There are several different terminologies that can be used. There's Black English, BE, Black English Vernacular, BEV, African American Vernacular English, AAVE, or simply what we call African American English, AAE. The term African American English is consistent with a name that will be used to describe the ethnic group with which it's predominantly identified. Standard American English and General American English are better referred to as the Mainstream American English, or MAE. Pidgin is what we call a simplified and a limited system of communication that develops because usually, or sometimes it happens where there are two communities that don't have any common language and they're forced by circumstances to communicate. One of our best examples of that happens to be Creole, which is spoken in Louisiana. There were two languages and they came up with their own unique language out of two separate languages, and that's Pidgin. Code switching is a bit different. Code switching tends to refer to when a person is switching from one language to another or one dialect to another. So some people may use African American English with their friends, but maybe in a work environment they may tend to use Standard American English or Mainstream American English, and that would be known as code switching. So let's talk a little bit more about African American English and what we know about it. African Americans have a very rich language tradition. There's a very rich cultural heritage, family relationships are very important, and mutual help and support are highly valued in the African American society. And there are also major language characteristics of African American English. If you look at Table 5.1, you'll see what some of the African American English characteristics are and how they compare to Mainstream American English statements versus African American English statements. If you take a look at Table 5.1 and you look at the first one, you'll notice that the noun possessive might be omitted. So in a sentence such as, "That's the woman's car," you may hear, "that the woman car." Or sometimes third person singular may also be omitted, and you may hear for Mainstream American English, "She walks to school," but in African American English you might hear, "She walked to school." So you need to keep this in mind, especially if you're doing a language evaluation, which you may be learning about in other classes, so that will help you better understand what you're evaluating and what is considered typical of that particular language versus what is something that is different. many phonological characteristics that are common to African American English and Standard American English, there are unique phonological features of African American English, so it should not be interpreted as a phonological disorder. And you also need to keep in mind that not all speakers of African American English use all the unique phonological features of African American English. So sometimes they're used and other times they're not used. So, ungliding generally means the reducing of diphthongs into single vowels. That you'll see as a common characteristic, one of the characteristics. There are also more consonants than vowels that differ across African American English and mainstream American English. There are also omission of consonants in final word positions and consonant cluster reductions. What's also noted is that there are omissions and substitutions of sounds that are often well heard in the medial and final positions of words that tend to give African American English its characteristic feature. Some of the things that you may also hear as examples of deletion of final consonants, for example, take the word bad, as if you would say it in mainstream American English. In the word bad, if it's produced in African American English, you would just hear simply ba. That would be a deletion of the final consonant. It does not make it a speech error, it just makes it a characteristic of AAE. A consonant cluster reduction in an initial or final position might be for the word, let's say, rest for mainstream American English. But in African American English, you may hear simply res. And unstressed syllable deletions may give you an example such as for the word about, the in about is an unstressed syllable, but simply in African American English, that would be dropped and you would hear just bout. Articulatory development in children who speak African American English. Well, there's limited data on acquisition of AAE speech sound patterns. And speech sounds that the African American English children tend to misarticulate are also similar to what the Caucasian children produce. So keep in mind that well-known characteristics such as final consonant deletion, cluster reduction, unstressed syllable deletion, and certain sound substitutions should not be interpreted as evidence of an articulation disorder or poor speech development in this population. Assessment of articulatory phonological disorders in African American children. Unfortunately, there are few standardized tests that are available, and that makes it a bit of a problem when you're testing somebody who speaks African American English. Many of the tests that we have on the market tend to be biased towards Caucasian children. And it may be where children may see pictures and they may not even be familiar with what that particular vocabulary item is because they may not have had exposure to it. So it might be a good idea to take conversational speech or connected speech over an articulation test so that you can get a good idea as to what kinds of errors or differences that you may hear. Oral reading samples are also beneficial because then you could take a look at some of the areas that you know are not characteristics of African American English, and those might be the errors that you may pick up on. So in this assessment, it does allow for normal speech behavioral patterns to play their roles, but it may be too cumbersome if you have a large caseload and you don't have sufficient time to do it. That's why the connected speech samples don't always work very well, especially if you're working in a school system. So it's often necessary to try to obtain data collection from many different sources, including the teacher, interviewing a caregiver or parents, and comparing to similar peers. Let's talk about treatment of articulatory phonological disorders in African American children. The goal should be that the treatment context and treatment goal should be close to what mainstream American English is. The rationale is that African American English is very similar in the sound inventory as it is for mainstream American English. So it is considered a legitimate goal to teach mainstream American English sound patterns since many speakers may encounter issues with social, vocational, academic, or other situations that may require sound patterns of mainstream American English. However, this is something that you do want to discuss with parents. Now, let's take a look at this example. If the word that you're looking for is bathtub, but the child says bathtub using a f sound, that is considered something that's typical of their speech. If it's something that the parents would like to be worked on and they would like to have a good interdental sound for that th, then you would certainly work on that. And that's something you do need to discuss with a family member or caregiver. Let's talk briefly about Native American languages. Again, unfortunately, there's very limited research in this area. However, we do know that there are about 2.7 million Native Americans, according to the U.S. Bureau of Census, according to 2005, and that may have changed even since then. But according to your textbook, that's the information that we've been given. Many school-aged children who come from Native American languages may not live on the reservations with their parents, so they may be able to attend school. So they may not be speaking Native American languages or be exposed to it. But we do need to keep in mind that they may have some cultural differences. So there's great variety and limited information about the origin of Native American language families. We do know that Native Americans belong to more than 500 separate tribal groups, and each of those has even a different culture and language. We do also know that 1/2 of all Native Americans are younger than 21 years of age. And Native Americans live in all parts of the U.S. However, about half of them, 50% of the population, live in the western states, and they tend to be more in the states such as New Mexico, California, Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Arizona. There's also a website that you can look at to look at the very different at the varieties of languages at http://www.native-languages.org/languages.htm, which lists the 800 Native American languages. Now, many sources will also suggest that there are at least 200 Native American languages in North America alone. But we also know that many Native Americans, especially as I said earlier, the younger people don't speak their native language. However, they may be exposed to it due to their peers, due to their parents, or due to the people that they may be in contact with, like aunts, uncles, and grandparents. Some of the phonological characteristics that we may see of people with Native American language is that most Native American languages have been undergoing a lot of changes since time, such as Old Blackfoot versus New Blackfoot. In this area, there are no diphthongs in Old Blackfoot, but it's emerging in what they call New Blackfoot as part of the Native American language. We also know that this glottal stop is one of the few sounds that are common to most Native American languages. P, T, K are also unaspirated in Native American language. So, unfortunately, we don't have a reliable, systematic observation of the articulatory and phonological development in Native American children. So the data on this is very limited. Articulatory development in children speaking Native American languages. So because there's very limited information, there's poor available observations that are reliable and systematic. We don't know as much as we probably should about Native American languages and how we can compare that to articulatory and phonological development. Native American languages really are mostly alive in the older adults. Most children of Native American families are speaking English. So we need more information to learn more about this area. And if you're somebody who is considering pursuing a PhD in speech-language pathology, this might be a very interesting area to observe, read about, and perhaps do some research on some of our reservations. Assessment of articulatory and phonological disorders in Native American children. In our country, we have very limited speech-language pathologists that are Native Americans. If you happen to be a Native American and you're studying speech-language pathology, you have a great advantage. If a Native American child speaks English as a second language learner, the speech-language pathologist must treat him or her as if the child is bilingual. The resources for the Native American language and culture are critical. We need to know as much as we can about Native American languages. If you look at your table 5.3, you can see the summary of the communication style of Native American people. For instance, what's interesting is that Native American mothers, especially those in the Navajo population, may be silent with their infants. They may not talk very much. So infants may not have a lot of exposure to sounds as they're learning them. Speech, language, and hearing difficulties occur 5 times more frequently among Native Americans than in the general population. Why is that? Is it because maybe they don't have the health care services that other citizens of this country do? That's a possibility. Also, children often do not answer a question unless they are sure or very confident that their answer is correct. So you need to consider their communication style when you're doing an evaluation. So when you're treating somebody with a Native American language, the treatment material should be familiar to the child. You may not show them things that they're not exposed to when using different kinds of stimuli. If the child only speaks Native American, then the speech-language pathologist really needs to be proficient in that language in order to treat the speech disorder, if possible. That is especially true if there's a language disorder, because how can a speech-language pathologist help somebody with language if they don't know the language? And we also need to keep in mind that cultural values about effective communication, speech disabilities, and educational goals should be planned with a family. And that's probably true across most areas in the various cultures that you'll be dealing with. Spanish language. The term Hispanic is used a lot, and it's used for people whose primary language is Spanish. And you'll hear Hispanic or you might hear Latino. But it's used for people who speak Spanish and English, with one of the two being a dominant language. As I said, Latinos is also a term that's been used. The Spanish language has a wide geographic distribution. We have people who speak Spanish in Spain. We have people who speak Spanish in Puerto Rico and in other countries as well too, in Cuba. And they all have different variations in the way they speak the language. Puerto Rican Spanish is different than Spain type of Spanish. But what we do know in this country is that Hispanics are a growing population, and in the United States, Spanish happens to be the second most common language. So you will hear the terms, both Hispanic and Latino, being used throughout this chapter. Do keep in mind that Hispanic terminology tends to be associated sometimes because of the Spain's dominance of the people in parts of the Americas. What is also interesting is what they're predicting is that by the year 2050, the number of people who speak Spanish may exceed 63 million, according to the latest census of 2005 in the U.S. Bureau of the Census. The phonological characteristics of Spanish-influenced English. It tends to be simpler than English, and if you happen to learn Spanish at one point or another, you might have thought that Spanish was not as difficult as maybe learning French, Hebrew, or any Arabic type of language. It only has 5 vowels. There are 18 consonants. The consonantal blends differ as they tend to be fewer and simpler as well. What you'll also notice is that the S cluster that you might see in the English language does not occur in Spanish. So for example, we might say school, you'll hear the sk, but in Spanish you would hear escuela. If you take a look at tables 5.4 and 5.5 in your textbook, you'll see the differences in language differences for children in Hispanic backgrounds. For example, the adjective will come after the noun. The house green is on the corner. So when I see children who may write that way in school and teachers bring this to my attention, I might say, according to their language, their first language, their adjective typically follows the noun. So that's important to know even when teachers are consulting with you regarding language patterns in either speaking or writing. If you take a look at table 5.5, you'll see that there are also articulatory and phonological characteristics that are very interesting. For example, the t, d, m may be dentalized, which means that the tip of your tongue is placed against the back of your upper, central incisors. They may go against your upper front teeth. Many times, final consonants can often be devoiced. They take away the voice. So instead of saying the word doze, they would say, instead I might doze off while I watch this movie. Somebody might say, I might dose off while I watch this movie. That would be also something very typical. And also a b for v substitution might be noted. So somebody might say berry for the word very. I like you very much. That's not unusual to be seen. Assessment of articulatory and phonological disorders in children of Spanish background. What is good is that there are standardized Spanish tests. So as I said, standardized Spanish tests are available on the market, which is really a very, very unique feature for some of us who have been in the field for many years. We haven't seen those kinds of things, and finally they're here. We're going to see more and more people speaking different languages, and hopefully we'll see the same thing with other languages for articulation and language tests. However, there are going to be times that interpreters may be used. So if it's just strictly an articulation test, you have to train an interpreter to help you give a test if no one else is available to administer a Spanish test. And there's specific guidelines that you would use. Also, again, I can't stress this enough, but it's very important to use a connected speech sample. And by that I mean you're asking a child or a client to give you running speech, to give you a regular conversation. But you really try to get them to speak more of a monologue. So you might ask them open-ended questions like, tell me about the best movie you ever saw and why you enjoyed it. Tell me all about what that movie was about. Learning two languages results in a dialectal variation of the second language. So there can be some influences of Spanish into the English language as well. So therapy of articulatory and phonological disorders in children of Spanish background. We need to consider similar guidelines as African American children. There is no treatment evidence that shows that treatment of bilingual children is more extensive than that of treatment of children who just have one language for articulation. The basic treatment principles will still apply. Stimuli should always be similar to what is in the child's home environment or what they're accustomed to. So there may be pictures that they may see that they've never had exposure to it. So you want to make sure that what you're presenting with them or for them should be similar to what they have. Consider that the clinician should treat phonological patterns that are exhibited with similar error rates in the two languages. He or she should also treat phonological patterns that are exhibited in the two languages with unequal frequency. Finally, clinicians should treat patterns that are evident in only one language as well. So it can vary depending upon what the needs are in one language, two languages, or both languages. Let's talk about the Asian and Pacific Islander languages. People living in Asian countries and the Pacific Islands are ethnoculturally and linguistically varied that the terms Asian and Pacific Islander do not really do any justice to this variety. There is such great cultural and linguistic variety. For example, China has 80 languages, just China alone. And it has many, many different dialectal variations even within that. We know that many Asian-born Americans tend to be bilingual or multilingual. So they may speak American, but they could also speak several different languages of the Chinese language. If you take a look at 5.6, the table that is in your book, you can see some of the major characteristics for language that are influenced by Asian languages. For example, there are omissions of plurals. So you may hear, here are 2 pieces of toast instead of here are 2 pieces of toast. Or they might have an omission of a copula. He going home now, they eating. Or you might even hear something such as a misordering of interrogatives, such as you're going now. Or sometimes there could be poor use of pronouns. She husband is coming. She said her wife is here. So those are the kinds of characteristics that you would see for people who have Asian language influence. These tables are actually very important to keep when you do practice speech-language pathology. You may want to copy this and keep it nearby if you're working in particular areas so that you know what to look for. You may want to laminate it and keep it on your bulletin board or keep it in a notebook, something that might make it very easy for you to reference back to. The phonological characteristics of Asian languages. Well, there are many patterns due to the many languages and language families that are in Asia. You have, for example, in Chinese versus English. Chinese and Mandarin are the 2 main dialects of Chinese that are spoken in the United States. Mandarin and Cantonese dialects of Chinese don't contain consonantal blends. So it can make learning English blends very difficult for somebody who is a Chinese speaker. Cantonese has 7 final consonants, whereas only Mandarin has 2. So Chinese speakers learning English may omit many English sounds that are in the final position. So for the word fish, they may only say fi. So 2 other variations that are found in speakers of Chinese also include stress and intonational patterns. Intonation is very important, especially in Asian languages. Syllable stress, however, tends to be misplaced in speaking English when you have somebody who speaks Chinese. An intonational pattern that's more appropriate to Chinese may be heard in English speech of native Chinese speakers. South Asian language versus English. That includes many of the countries of the Indian subcontinent. And in this region, the home is to several language families, which means the Indic languages of Indo-European family and the Dravidian languages. What you would like to keep in mind is that Hindi is spoken by a larger number of individuals, and it's the official language of India. So languages of India also differ in their tonal characteristics. Asian Indians who speak English as their second language tend to present with a rhythm that's different than the native English rhythm that we're accustomed to if you are an English speaker. There are also different sounds and different kinds of ways that they produce their speech depending on whether it's Indic or Dravidian languages. Southeast Asian languages versus English. Southeast Asian languages are spoken in such countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, Laos, and Vietnam. Vietnamese is a phonemic, monosyllabic, meaning 1 syllable, tonal language, and it has 3 major dialects which happen to be Central, Northern, and Southern. Unlike English, Vietnamese does not contain consonantal blends. So the syllable stress is not used to signal difference in meaning either. Vietnamese speakers have a lot of difficulties with a lot of English phonemes that happen to be absent in their own language, such as the th, or the p, g, j, zh, and so forth. East Asian languages versus English. The people of the Philippines are known as Filipinos, and they have at least 75 languages, although they tend to be varied. They all belong to the Polynesian group which has been identified. Tagalog happens to be the national language of the Philippines. And that Tagalog language contains 16 consonants, 5 vowels, and only 6 diphthongs. They don't have the English phonemes v, z, th, the voiced and voiceless th, j, f, sh, ch, and j. So they may omit many of those sounds when they're trying to speak American English. Korean is the language of Korea, naturally, and it's the member of the Altaic language family. Korean language has 21 consonants and 10 vowels. Korean has no labiodental, interdental, or palatal fricatives. So they may have different substitutions for some of those types of sounds. Japanese is spoken in the entire population of Japan, which belongs to the Altaic family of the languages. Japanese has 5 standard vowels, and some dialects have up to 3 additional vowels, and others are only 3. Japanese has 18 consonants, and some double consonants like k or p are also present. Arabic versus English. Arabic is the language of the Arabs. Many Arabs are Muslims, but not all Muslims speak Arabic. For example, Muslims in such countries such as Pakistan and India, they don't speak Arabic. More than 160 million people worldwide do speak Arabic. It's the member of the Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic family of languages and comprised over 175 languages. And Hebrew also happens to be a member of this large family. Standard or Classic Arabic has 28 consonants, although some sources say that there might be 32 consonants. What's interesting about Arabic is that modern Standard Arabic, which is the formal form of language, is hardly ever spoken, but it is used in religious contexts, drama, and literature. However, if you're using it on the street, or at home, or in shops, or if you're speaking just with other friends, you tend to use a colloquial variety of Standard Arabic. It's really like what we would call casual American speech. But children do learn Standard Arabic only when they enter school. And there are some noteworthy features that some consonants have variant forms that are all accepted. So therefore, in the assessment of children with an Asian background, things that we need to consider, well, there are so many Asian languages, so it makes it very difficult to make an appropriate assessment of a bilingual Asian American child's articulatory and phonological skills development. However, as clinicians or speech-language pathologists, we do need to be aware of the differences in the types of sounds that are used in many of the languages. That's why this textbook has great information for you to hold on to. And it's a book that you really should hold on to for a great resource for the future because it does give you a lot of that information. There's also a similar philosophy of assessing a child that is Spanish speaking or African American child. It isn't any much different when you're evaluating a child who is a child with an Asian background, as we stated earlier. The treatment of articulatory phonological disorders in children of Asian backgrounds, well, we need to have, there's a need to experimentally evaluate the effectiveness of various treatment procedures in treating bi and multi, meaning many languages, multilingual children. We also need to consider planning treatment that would be similar as it would be for Spanish-English bilingual children. Finally, in the last slide here are some guidelines that we should consider when we're working with children who have dual phonological repertoire. So children may have dual phonological repertoire because of 2 main reasons. There could be 2 dialects, which would be called bidialectalism, and bilingualism. African American children who speak both the African American English and mainstream American English have a dual phonological repertoire. Children who speak 2 languages, such as Spanish and English, or an Asian language and English, are considered bilingual. They have 2 languages. So African American English and mainstream American English really are the same type of English, but there's just a difference in some of the phonological differences. But there are more differences because of the languages in the other areas like Asian and Spanish. The things that you want to keep in mind when you're evaluating and treating these types of children are some of the things that you need to appreciate the communication style of the child and his or her family. Take time to get to know the family, speak to them. What are their feelings about communication? How is it important to them? What are their concerns? Be sure to study or obtain as much information on the phonological development in the child's first language. That can give you a lot of good information as to what you're looking for. Be sure that you select treatment targets in both the languages, as well as making sure that you determine if there is a presence of a disorder in both the languages or dialects. Again, keep in mind that according to the American Speech Language Hearing Association, no dialectal variation of a language is considered a deviation or a disorder. So if it's a difference, you wouldn't work on it. But if it's a significant deviation, then it would be a disorder. Try to get as much information as you possibly can on ethnocultural backgrounds by working with clients, reading up on the background as much as you can, and look at websites for more information. And as much as you possibly can, please try to be the child's advocate, especially if the parents are non-speaking or non-English speaking folks, so that you can help the child obtain his or her needs as best as possible. I'm currently working with a girl who is from a Spanish family, and her parents don't speak very much English. We often have to get a Spanish translator to come in, but the child sometimes will also help the parents understand homework exercises or things that maybe the family may need. We try sometimes to use Google Translate to get some information, to be able to convey some information, but I will tell you that Google Translate is not always accurate in the way the information is inputted. So you have to be very careful with that as well. So this concludes Chapter 5, Ethnocultural Variables that Affect Articulation and Phonological Development. This is Professor K. Thank you.